Afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Venner, and I'll be doing a presentation on supply chain management, specifically on the AS9100 standard, but it does cover areas of the 9001 standard also. So anyone with either of those standards will gain benefit from this. There is a questions section where you can ask questions within this webinar. Feel free to jot down questions as we go along. I may not get time to actually answer the questions during the presentation, but hopefully we'll have some time at the end. If not, I'll then be able to answer them afterwards. I can contact you separately. Okay. So give a little bit of background on how the sort of standards work. When the aerospace standard was created, it was actually designed for top tier organizations, but it was quickly adapted lower on down the tier. And every standard goes through an evolution. Every sort of 6 to 8 years, they will go through a change, and every other change will be a large change. So where we are at the moment with the current transition standards, so the Rev D and the 2015 version of 9001, we're currently in this optimization stage. So when standards come out, it will take 2 or 3 years for organizations to get used to the new requirements. And we're in that phase now. So people are starting to get used to them. And previously, organizations have just had a system for managing supply chain, but now it's time to optimize that and actually start getting the benefit from them. So a lot of organizations have just had a system in place that met the requirements. Now it's time to actually develop those, make sure you're gaining the full benefit from supply chain management. Okay, with supply chains, especially in aerospace standard, they're getting very complex, they're getting very large. Used to be sort of 1 or 2 tiers, now we're getting 3 and 4 tiers down. So what that means is the food chain is a lot longer than what it used to be, and as it gets longer, it gets more complex and harder to control. So we have the primes near the top. They're people such as Boeing, Airbus, those type of organizations. Then we go down a tier, and we'll have people like Rolls-Royce, GKN, and then we go down another tier, and then so on and so on. And there's different requirements that organizations have depending on where you are in the chain as to what you need to focus on with regards to managing your supply chain. So the upper tier will spend a lot of time looking at their internal processes and then have a look at the supply chain itself, just down a tier. The lower tier organizations should focus more on the customer flow down. What are their customers asking them? And then they have to then flow that down to their sub tiers as well. So depending on where you are will depend on your focus and also some of the controls you need to be attentive to and things you might want to implement. How the supply chains are developed has created a lot of issues. So when organizations are using people down the lower tiers, they're finding that the controls in place aren't necessarily pulling out everything, all the customer requirements that they need. So those upper tiers need to ensure that their lower tier suppliers are flowing down those responsibilities as well. Okay, so there are 8 key elements to supply chain management. So we have supplier approval and surveillance process, a contract review process, production planning and first article inspection, ongoing product and process verification, monitoring of the performance of those suppliers, change management, which is kind of a new thing that's creating quite a few issues, manufacturing process control, and corrective action management. So these will be able to be followed by any organization, whether you're ISO 9000, AS9100, You could have the medical standards. You could also have the automotive standard. They're the same key principles that need to be followed. So we'll go into a little bit of detail on each of those. Okay, so the supplier approval and surveillance process. This is where you need to start within your system, and you need to document. Preferably, you don't have to document, but you at least need to define that process on how you are going to control your suppliers. This is kind of your thinking on what you're going to do, the controls you need to have in place, the technical requirements of each of your suppliers, depending on your products. Okay. The documented process should focus on the selection, audit, approval, and the disapproval of sub-tiers. Customers need to be thought about. Are they instigating certain suppliers? Are they delegating those to you? Who they are, how you're going to control them? Because just because a customer tells you to use a certain supplier, you're still responsible for those, which I know creates a lot of problems in the industry, but you're still ultimately responsible. Process flow downs, how you're going to ensure that the sub-tiers are being controlled adequately, not just your supplier, but their suppliers. Frequency of audits, anything you're going to do to monitor the performance, record retention, things like that. Okay, you need to actually set those out before you can start anything else. The problem we have in the supply chain is the further down your suppliers are within that food chain, there's a higher risk. And a lot of organizations, when they're developing their supplier process, they're not considering the risks of that supply chain. So we'll go into a little bit more detail around that. So supplier approval and surveillance process, you need to think about the QMS requirements, and that's the QMS requirements of your suppliers and possibly their sub-tiers. Do you require them to have ISO 9001? Do you need them to have AS9100? Do they need specialist approvals such as AS9081? You get certain things as NADCAP approval in the aerospace industry for special processes. There are all kinds of things that you need to think about on what your supply chain needs to have in place. You also need to think what happens to that management system, that approval, should that organization lose that certificate. What are your monitoring processes in place for that, and what's the reaction you'll take? Don't always think of your direct supplier, you need to think of your sub-tiers as well. So if you're requiring your supplier to have, let's say, AS9100, do you need to ensure that the sub-tiers of that supplier also have in place AS9100? Because one big part of the standard is flow down of requirements. So you need to be clear with your suppliers what you are expecting of any of their suppliers in turn. So what we call sub-tiers. So supplier surveillance. So supplier surveillance is how you're going to monitor those suppliers. Are you going to do product performance? Frozen processes, are you going to audit those? So frozen processes are basically where you've set something in stone. That's what you've agreed to. That's what was approved at the first point of product supply, and it's verifying that they haven't made any changes to that process. Maybe you'll do QMS compliance audits. Okay, maybe you'll just rely on third-party certification bodies such as NQA to do those. You have the Oasis tool that you can use to monitor supplier audits as well. So it's something you need to think about. And then how the sub-tiers are going to be managed. Maybe you put a stipulation onto your suppliers about how they're going to manage their sub-tiers themselves. And new supplier monitoring. Many organizations will just have a carte blanche process for monitoring their suppliers. But when you get new suppliers on, you should think about the additional controls that you might want to have in place. You do not necessarily know those suppliers, you haven't got the history, you haven't got the relationship. So you need to think maybe you need to do something else for those new suppliers. Put them on a higher monitoring rate, for example, for the first 6 to 12 months. Maybe you do small little orders to begin with, just so they can prove their performance. Okay, so the contract review process, this is probably where we find a lot of issues within supply chain controls. Organizations will get an award for a job, or they'll have a tender, they'll submit that tender. A lot of the information within that tender document it's not full. So when you then receive an order, you then need to verify that you actually have, if there's any additional information provided in there, or if you need to go back to your customer, maybe the price will need to change. Okay, you should have a two-stage process for your contract review process as well. So maybe brand new jobs, they'll go through various different departments to get reviewed and approved. So purchasing, for example, production, all departments like that will have a look over it. When there's a repeat job, you may divert of those as long as there's no changes. What you do need to be aware of during the contract review stage is the stipulations that are being placed on you as a supplier for your sub-tier controls. What are the things you need to be aware of that you need to flow down to your own suppliers, if you're allowed to do them at all? Some contracts will not allow you to outsource any processes, so you need to be aware of that, what you can and can't do, and ensure any changes are highlighted during your contract review process. Okay. Production planning and production process verification. These processes are generally used for new products and design changes. They're often called PPAPs, First Article Inspection Reports, ISIRs, APQPs. They form various different methods depending on the customer. So your contract review should pull out anything that is being stipulated by your customers to what you need to then implement and provide to that. Now, as a supplier, you need to be aware of anything that you then need to flow down to your sub-tiers as well. If you are a buyer and you're issuing the contracts down to your suppliers, think about what you need from them to be able to demonstrate that they can meet your production requirements. Okay, so generally when a new product's come in place, you may say, I need an initial sample done of 3 parts. I'll get a first article inspection back, and then you'll review those reports before they're allowed to do full production. Their sub-tiers may also need to perform that operation. When you perform design changes, you then need to ask yourself, what do you need of your suppliers in order to revalidate that process? Do you need new first articles? Do they need to do some other kind of verification? It's important to make sure you're communicating that down to your supply chain so that they know what they have to provide to you. Product relocation, that's quite an interesting one. It could be full production relocation. Maybe you will change suppliers. If you change suppliers, what do you need to do to reevaluate those? But it could also be maybe moving the supplier themselves and moving next door. What do you need to revalidate that process? Machines need to be recalibrated, reset. Maybe you need new first article inspections. You need to make sure that's communicated down to your suppliers and they're aware of everything they need to do to meet your needs. And likewise, if you're a supplier, you need to ensure that that information is flowed down to your sub-tiers as well. Requalification because of audit findings, change in supplier ranking, loss of certification. That's what I was mentioning earlier. If someone loses their certification, what are you going to do about that? Do you need to find alternative suppliers? Do you need to get it requalified? Do you need to just be on site or have additional inspections performed on those parts? Are you actually going to allow it? Maybe you take the work away from them. Think about the controls you need for any changes that your suppliers are going to be performing. So ongoing product and process verification. This is about how you're going to monitor those products that are coming through from your suppliers. Are you going to be performing source inspection? Are you actually going to visit the suppliers to perform that? It's quite common in the aerospace industry for customers to actually be on site at their supplier sites to do the final verification of products before they're shipped. In other parts of the world, they actually have government sign off to do that. That's mostly in America. But you need to think about what needs to be in place for your products. Receive an inspection. What's the inspection you're going to be performing when the goods are received? Are you going to be doing 100% inspection, doing a sample inspection? There's things such as doctor stock within the industry where parts don't even get opened in the boxes, they go straight to line. If you're going to do something like that, you need to think about the controls that you're going to have in place at the supplier sites. You may want to have things such as control plans in place. What are you doing that makes you satisfied that you don't even need to open the box and it can go straight to line? You'll want some kind of verification off of the supplier that they're controlling that process to give you confidence in that product. Some people use it just for consumables. Some people use doctor stock for actual manufactured parts, but to control that, they will have a control plan in place to make sure the parts are provided as required. Delegated inspection authority. So this is more where you have delegated authorities at your supplier sites. Maybe it's only Bob Smith, for example, that is allowed to do the final inspection. Maybe they have been trained to your requirements to perform those inspections and no one else can do it. So think about how you're going to approve those people, how you're going to get your suppliers to monitor those people, and how you're going to check that those people are in fact doing the inspection. Then last bit, think about the sub-tiers. Ensure the information's flowing down to your suppliers and that they are in turn flowing that down to their suppliers. A lot of the time you won't even know where the parts are coming from. You'll ask your supplier to perform something and then they will outsource something which may be perfectly fine within your terms and conditions, but are they informing you of those outsourced processes, and are they indeed controlling them as they should be? Some other kinds of inspection that you may want to do, I think about, you've got visual inspection, dimensional inspection. Are you actually going to take dimensional inspection reports? Maybe you'll just do a small sample of a few key characteristics. Are you going to do functional tests? Material property, which is an interesting one in the standards, talks about possibly testing the raw material. If there's a high risk of counterfeit part, sampling inspection, take 10%, something like that. That should be an approved sampling plan. There are some out there, BS 6001, things like that. Maybe you'll just check documentation. There's lots of different things you can do, but you should specify what that method is going to be. And it could change depending on the supplier, could change depending on the part, could change depending on the volume. That information should be clear and should be communicated to your goods receiving inspection department so that they know exactly what they're supposed to be checking. monitor their supplier performance. This is always an interesting one, and not something that organisations probably do correctly in most cases. When we tend to ask people what they're doing about the supplier performance, they'll just paint everyone with the same brush, so to speak. They'll say, okay, well, we're going to monitor every shipment, and then we'll just check everyone once a year in the management review, making sure their performance is okay. It's not the most effective method. What you should be doing is focusing on where your key risks are. So the standard does talk about doing risk management of your supply chain. And what you should be doing is saying, okay, are these critical to my business or are they non-critical? And maybe they're just consumables. And you should be treating everyone differently. So when you do your supplier approval process, you should then start putting them into these different categories. Most people will look at the risk and just say, I've known this guy for 10 years, never let me down, so he's low risk. That's not really the method you should be using. You should be looking at 3 different pillars: product and application. So what is that product? Where is it going to be used? What's it being used for? Are they critical? So is it life dependent? That type of thing. The source of supply. Where are they in the food chain? Are they an OEM? Did they make the part? Original equipment manufacturer? Organisations like that. Or are they further down? Are they a distributor? Have they got known performance issues? What's the impact of that supplier on the overall supply objective? For argument's sake, if they're late by 2 days, does it impact the final product? Things like that. And then the supplier assessment. Have you been to the supplier? Do you know them? Are they known in the industry, or are they new to, say, your sector, such as aerospace? Do they have a management system in place? So you should be looking at those 3 different key areas and then putting them into certain pots. So we could say critical suppliers, non-critical consumables. We will then focus most of our attention on the critical. Non-critical, we'll focus some attention, but not too much. And then consumables, we possibly won't even monitor, in all honesty. Consumables generally get the next day or a couple of days after. You have a stock held of them. They're not important. I'm not actually going to monitor those suppliers. Critical, you could say, I'm going to monitor them every month. I'm going to visit them every 6 months. I'm going to deliver performance results to those. Whatever you determine as necessary for your business is what you can put into that category. And then non-critical, these are suppliers you maybe use fairly often. The products are not life critical. You're buying from the OEMs, things like that. We'll monitor them, but maybe we'll monitor them just every 6 months. Focus all your attention on the critical. So you'll probably, as a percent, sort of the 80-20 rule, you'll have a lot of your critical suppliers. There won't be that many actually. There's probably going to be a 10, 20, depending on your size. But it'll allow you to then focus your attention on those and not worry too much about the smaller suppliers that don't have an impact on your business. So when we actually put those risk processes out, we have application risk and product risk as the first one, source of supply risk as the middle one, and then the supplier assessment risk. So these are just some things that I've put in myself, the types of things that I see. So when we look at application and product risk, we can say non-critical applications are low risk, life dependent are high risk at the bottom, and then you can see there's a gradual step depending on what that product is being used for. And the middle one, source of supply risk. Are they the original equipment manufacturers? Are they the people that make them? Are they then the authorized distributors? These are the lower risk suppliers. The higher risk are unknown sources, organizations you've never heard of, you're not too sure where they came from. they've actually got issues reported against them. So there are websites you can look at where there are known issues against certain suppliers. Are they on this register? That poses a higher risk to your organisation. And then the supplier assessment risk we've got as the last one, third one along. You've visited them, you audit them. That's a low risk supplier. Higher risk are new suppliers, less than 1 year in business, and then they slowly build up that reputation, and you can start looking at the certifications they have in place. 9001 is obviously very different to AS9100, so treat those suppliers slightly differently. You should monitor them different or expect different controls in place over a 9001 and an AS9100. And then you get the specialist ones such as NADCAP and AS6081. Treat those suppliers differently. When we go in and we look at people's supplier systems, how they're monitoring their performance, they're all the same. What you may want to do when you think about those critical, non-critical, and the consumables is have different levels of performance on what you expect of those. Critical suppliers, critical to the business, critical to the product. You may say we want 99% on-time delivery and 95% quality, for example. Non-critical, you could then drop that down and say 95% on-time delivery, 90% quality, things like that. So don't treat them all the same. You expect more of your critical suppliers as they have a bigger impact on your business. So put them into those categories after doing your risk assessment and communicate to those suppliers what you expect of them, what levels of performance. Why penalize a consumable supplier for late delivery when really it doesn't matter to you? Okay, you're expecting too much of some of those lesser important suppliers and maybe not enough from the high risk suppliers to you. So monitoring the suppliers themselves, some of the things you can look at: escapes, products they're letting out. Parts per million is a measure that they can have internally. Product non-conformities, on-time delivery, their audit results, how are they performing in their third-party audits or the audits that you're performing on those. Percentage of first time through first article inspection reports. That can build up some confidence in their production system. Are you getting the parts through? Are they good on the fairs? If they're not good on the fairs, then you kind of sort of question their inspection process because they should have pulled out these issues. They should have been completing them right, things like that. Any source inspection results, if you perform that. Receiving inspection results, which is generally what organisations do, where you're measuring quality, how many NCRs you're raising, and also response to supplier corrective action requests. If they're not responding to you, what are you doing about it? Are they, a lot of them still open? Are they open for more than 30 days? Things like that. In any case, you need to tell the supplier what you're expecting of them. Tell them what's acceptable for on-time delivery. Tell them what's acceptable for quality levels, and feed that information back to them. They won't be able to fix a lot of the things if you don't tell them. So if you're expecting that of them, tell them what you're expecting and tell them what their results are. Don't keep the results to yourself. They'll only improve if they know where they're failing, because they don't always know where they're failing internally. They believe they're shipping everything fine, on time, with the correct paperwork. You may phone up and just have little niggles at them, but really what's the true impact on your business? They don't necessarily know that. So just communicate that back to suppliers. I don't know any supplier yet that's received a feedback scorecard or anything like that from their customers that hasn't then got to work to try and improve that. If they see they're below the target, they'll then try and strive towards it. And again, as a third-party auditor, if I go in, if I see their performance isn't there, I'm going to then start questioning it, and I can help try and move their results up. I'll be asking them, well, what are you doing about getting to that level that you've got to be at? If you don't send that to your suppliers and we don't see it. Very difficult for us to do something. Okay, so just giving a little example about monitoring the supplier performance. I say there is actually a requirement in AS9100 that you have to feed that back to your suppliers. It isn't in 9001 as a mandatory requirement, but I highly recommend it. The low risk ones, your consumables, for example, you probably won't send anything to, but your critical ones and your non-critical, you probably will send something to them. Make sure you're sending them regular basis, make sure the information's accurate, and allow them to challenge some of the results. We all know that sometimes people don't book things in on time. Where are you capturing this on-time delivery? When you book it into your system, well, it could have been sitting there for a few days. So that's often a challenge. So make sure your data's accurate and you send that back to them accurately, because if it's not accurate, they tend to just ignore it in all cases, because they'll then know that they're better than what you're reporting back to them. And hopefully over time, you'll see some improvements. Okay, so change management. There's a requirement for organizations to notify their customers of any changes. What are those changes? When do they need to notify you? What are you communicating to those suppliers on when they can make a change without approval and when they need to notify you? If they're moving machines, do they need to notify you? If they're changing personnel, do they need to notify you? Is it just an admin change they're making? Never assume that they're telling you everything, because often we find they're not. Okay, so I went to one organization. They were using one supplier for 10 years, same part, no change for 10 years. That supplier in turn hadn't changed their suppliers. Okay, so there was two lines of supply. And all of a sudden, this organization started to get rejects on the parts. They went back to their supplier. Well, we haven't changed anything. That supplier went back to their own supplier. What it turned out is they had then changed their suppliers, and it turned out to be a counterfeit part in the end. They decided not to buy it off the OEM. They could get it cheaper elsewhere. The price started coming through as normal, so they still assumed it was the same part, and the part was failing. So they had big issues there. So although their supplier hadn't changed anything, their sub-tiers had changed something. So it's trying to make sure you're getting that information up from the sub-tiers, but you need to put the onus on your suppliers because you're not going to know everything. So what is your supplier doing to ensure that the sub-tiers are notifying them of changes? It can get very complex. Also had another organization. I went in to perform an assessment, and they had gone next door. So they had 2 units. One unit was the one I always visit, and then they're also in next door now due to expansion. They hadn't actually notified us of that change. Okay, so we turned up, they'd moved machines, they'd done all kinds of different things. They had painting in there. They didn't tell their customers. They just thought they could make that change. Basically, they'd been shipping parts for 9 months without authorization because they needed to have AS9100, but because they didn't have it for that next door unit, technically 9 months worth of parts had to be recalled. So it was actually quite a big mistake that they made there, and they didn't really think about the changes that they were doing. So you as a customer need to ensure that you're being clear to your suppliers what changes they can make, what changes they can't, and how you get notified of that. So manufacturing process controls, you can get PFMEAs, process failure. risk assessments, basically. Control plans, SPCs, SPC charts, getting data on the performance, and key characteristics monitoring. That can be quite an interesting one where organizations aren't flowing down what are key characteristics to their suppliers. So a lot of suppliers just assume there aren't any. So a key characteristic is something that has to be controlled and monitored, because the change, if it's outside of the requirements, will have a big impact on the overall quality. So you need tighter control over that. If you don't tell your suppliers what are those key characteristics, they probably won't be monitoring them. They don't know what you're using the parts for often. So make sure you're clear, either in the drawings or on some kind of specifications, what monitoring you need of those critical dimensions or features, because it can be color, and make sure they're controlling that. Maybe you get the data for that. Maybe you just check up on it every 6 months. Maybe you do an audit there just to make sure they are monitoring that. Just communicate that to your suppliers, because they're not going to do something if they don't have to, because it's money at the end of the day. Corrective actions. You're flowing down corrective action requirements to your suppliers. Do they respond? When they do respond, what are those actions like? Are they good? Are they really putting some effort into finding the root cause of the issues, or are they just filling something in, sending it back, and you're saying, yep, that's okay, I'm filing it? You might need to support the suppliers on that. Yes, many organizations are AS9100, possibly 9001, but if they haven't got anything in place, they might not be used to doing corrective actions, and they may not fully understand it. Are you getting repeat non-conformances? If so, the corrective actions they've implemented aren't effective. What are you going to do about that? If you keep getting repeat issues, do we go to them? Do we help them? What are we going to do to make sure next time we aren't getting the same non-conformances again? How are you verifying those corrective actions being effective? Do you put tighter controls on your next 5 shipments from that supplier? Something like that. So just as a general summary, think about the food chain and the risks associated with each level. Where are your suppliers in that food chain? Where's the risk? What risks are there against your management system? And then put in additional controls around that. Flowing down the requirements. Make sure you're flowing down what you expect from your suppliers. Make sure it's documented, because otherwise third-party assessors such as myself don't see that. So we'll assume there was nothing flowed down, but also then ensure that those are flowed down to their sub-tiers. How are you making sure that your suppliers are flowing those down to their sub-tiers? How are you going to monitor the product and the service? Think about the full chain of custody of that product that you're receiving. How far down is it going? Inspection and test methodology. How are you going to monitor those products? Don't just think about one level down, think about many levels down. Okay, so that's the end. So do we have any questions? Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any questions. If anyone does have any questions after this, please email aerospace@nqa.com and we'll be able to answer them then. Okay, Thank you.